as he mentioned, my name is Stefan, and this is my face. So my background is in computing science and mathematics, and I exclusively work in small or early companies. And for the past couple of years, I've been building Mindstone, which is education / learning startup. So thank you for coming to my talk. And my talk name is Democratizing Complexity Production Cases for LLMs. And I'm gonna explain what that means in a bit. But we've seen quite a lot of talks recently about ChatGPT in general, and it's no surprise because it is such a useful product and it can do like so many things. But they are all quite focused around how to use ChatGPT as a product itself, and not necessarily how do you build products and how do you use this new infrastructure to put it into features that you're currently developing. So what does it mean, actually, the title of my talk? So we're starting from backwards. So LLMs, they're large language models. They're models, like GPT that you've heard so much about, and they're just very, very big models trained on like a large set of parameters. When we talk about production cases, what does that mean? Well, I'm going to show you a few examples of features that we've developed at Mindstone that are currently running in production, running at scale, and what are sort of how to implement them, and what are the issues that we sort of encountered when we sort of use this quite new technology that's still like maturing, and sort of what are the tools that you can use to help you make sure that sort of nothing breaks when you actually develop with these LLMs. And in terms of democratizing complexity, what democratizing means in the technological sense, it means that access to technology just becomes more accessible. And I'm going to dive first into like why and what they've actually democratized by letting us use this big models. So I started my career maybe roughly 12, 13 years ago, and I used to like go to a lot of these conferences as a young up and coming engineer in your career. You want to like absorb all this knowledge, and at the time, all the sort of talks that you would get would be about cloud computing, right? You're actually gonna see like one of these three companies being talked about, like AWS, Microsoft Azure, Google Cloud, and every conference that you would go to, this is sort of what everybody wanted to know about. And it's because they democratized cloud computing at that time, right? Before they sort of came along, and I think Google Cloud like got released around 2008. So yeah, it's around 15 years ago at this point. So what they do democratize is, if you wanted to build a product before they came along, you had to have a server somewhere. So you have to, have a server either in-house or literally just rent like rack space from people, and then do like all the management on top. Make sure the hardware doesn't break, make sure you have, replicability, make sure you have consistency, make sure, you have cross-region, like all of those things would be manual work. And like, unless you are a decently large organization that could like afford to have like on-premise machines, you just weren't online. And we've seen in the past like 10, 15 years, nowadays everybody has an online presence, and this is sort of what they did for the industry. And I'll be really, really surprised if anyone on this talk like it's self-hosting their own products, and they're not using like any of these sort of big three. And what I'm arguing here is that LLMs are a similar kind of infrastructure, and obviously the dust has not settled yet, but it seems like these are currently the big three players in the space. And what I'm arguing is that they are democratizing access to AI and to LLMs in a similar fashion that the cloud providers did for infrastructure. And I wanted to like highlight just a quick example for that. And we know Google has been involved in AI, and also like internally just using LLMs for their organization for quite a few years. But Google, like DeepMind, which is specifically their AI division, has like more than 1,000 employees. And And unless, again, you are like such a huge organization that you could actually afford having an internal department to serve your AI needs, you just weren't using AI at all, right? You were satisfied with just not using it because you couldn't. You didn't have the resources, you didn't have the people, you didn't have the money to actually go and train. You didn't have a way to collect all this data at all. So you are out of luck. So this is what they're democratizing. And the question is, okay, now we have access to all of these LLMs. What can we do with them? And we know how this started. ChatGPT launched sort of at the end of last year, and it became like the fastest growing product at the time. Obviously, threats have sort of overtaken it now, which tells you if people are afraid from AIs or like social media more. You never know, but ChatGPT launched, and everybody sort of tried to mimic that. And you could see like so many products that would come out in the space from then to now that would use the similar sort of chatbot style that they showcase. There was chat with your PDF. Duolingo came with a feature which is also a chatbot. Snapchat had like an AI chatbot inside of it. There are quite a fun like things you can do as well, like AI Dungeons, which lets you play like Dungeons and Dragons through AI. There were even somewhat ridiculous things like CatGPT. What if ChatGPT was a cat? But like the point that I'm making here is that all of these companies wanted to be seen as innovative, and obviously wanted to be seen as like, okay, we're using this new technology, but what problem did it actually solve for them? When you really think about it, do people really have a need to chat to an AI in like Snapchat? They weren't really thinking about, does this feature fit into our platform? It was more like, we have this technology, what feature can we build around it? And in reality, like when you're building products, you don't build technology first, you build with the problem first in mind. And I wanted to showcase you in Mindstone sort of what are features that you could build on top of LLMs that are maybe like a little bit different and not necessarily a chatbot. So the first, feature that we built, of course, we're not immune to what I just spoke about. We kind of built a chatbot as well in the beginning, right? Okay, it's not necessarily a chatbot; it's more like a question and answer bot. And what I mean by this is, so Mindstone is an education and learning company. It allows you to put a piece of content in, or an article in, or even a video in anywhere from the web, and you can sort of ask questions on it. And that's because in the science of learning is quizzing yourself. And if you are in uni, you probably use like flashcards at the time. Testing yourself on a piece of content is an extremely valuable way to actually retain this information that you're learning. And that was sort of our first try. Like, okay, let's try, generating some questions on this piece of content. And you can be like, okay, explain this to me like I'm 5, or have GPT sort of generate questions on this text that you've highlighted. And I wanted to do a small comparison. So we talk a lot about democratizing access to this just now. So how would you do this before these LLMs sort of came about? And I'm going to explain what this screenshot. So we are about a 3-year-old company, and this is a screenshot posted from me in Slack, and I can see in June 2020. And at the time, I did try to actually have this feature built, and being able to put in a piece of content and have the system sort of produce questions for flashcards on your behalf, so you can test yourself. And the only way you could do it at the time, so I ended up training our own model. You had to have first a data set. So you needed to have paragraphs and questions and an example. So you had to have this like big data set, so you could train a certain model to understand, what is a paragraph and what is a question. Then at that point, you had to learn some natural language processing on top to map the individual words to what are called like objects. So for example, the piece of content I was using here was about the Scottish referendum at the time, because I studied in Scotland, so this is very relevant for my context. And you would map, for example, Scotland to something called a GP, which is like a geopolitical entity. And you would map the party in question to be like an organization. And then you would try to produce a certain question out, like what was the name of the country referred to in this paragraph, or like what was the name of the organization referred to in this paragraph. And to be honest, it took me a fairly long time to like gather everything, produce this, make sure, you know, it's sensible. And looking at the success rate, it was just like around 60%, you know, like that's like marginally better than like a coin flip of like if it would actually produce something valuable or if it wouldn't, right? So this is something where you need a lot of people, a lot of resources, a lot of time to get right. And like, to be honest, it takes a long time to like acquire this knowledge, and you're gonna hit a ceiling for yourself at some point. So this was like an impossible task for us at the time, and we didn't end up shipping it. We ended up cutting it, and we said like maybe in 10 years time when we have the resources and the people, we're actually going to do this. You know, LLMs are out, you know, record scratch, LLMs are out like 2 years later. Now you could just ask it. And obviously this is a very, very simple, basic prompt, because it's not necessarily about the prompt. Even with a prompt as simple as that, you could pass it the context of the article, you could pass it the paragraph and just ask it, hey, generate some questions for me that I can test myself on. And it will. And this is exactly what we mean by democratizing. And looking a bit further, the second thing, or the second example that I have for you is moderation. So we have, when we register, because we have a way to share this piece of content, we ask you to pick a username. And, you know, usernames, you kind of want to moderate them at some point. You don't want people to, you know, pick explicit usernames or, you know, put their names necessarily in, because GDPR and like personal identifying information and all of that. And if you think about it, like before LLM sort of came into being, how did you do that? Well, the answer is you outsource it. So before I built Mindstone, or we started Mindstone, I used to work for a company, Super Awesome, that got acquired by Epic Games. And what Super Awesome provided was, one of the features was exactly this. Like, it was GDPR protection for children. That means whenever they would pick a username in Fortnite, you kind of don't want for them to, for example, put in their real names in, because that's protected data, or you wouldn't want for them to, you know, put explicit words in. And, you know, all of us have played Call of Duty. We know like the tendency of kids to like put really bad username. That's not something that you want. But, and the reality of the situation is, I took this from Two Hats website, which Microsoft, by the way, bought them a couple of years ago. Literally all the big game publishers would outsource this moderation problem to Two Hat, because the technology was very complicated. And also you wanted someone to take like the legal responsibility. So if you're at like a 10-person company like we are, what do you do? Well, nowadays you can ask, is this username explicit or not? And this is what we use. Obviously, you know, you have to be careful, because, you know, it's not really clear still what OpenAI is using with your data, right? So if you're actually sending personal identifiable information to OpenAI, it's not really clear what they're doing with it. So, you know, legally you have to be careful. But if you're just starting out and you need something like really, really basic that would serve your purpose, you could just ask it, and it works. And it's really surprising that it does, but it does. The third example I have for you is recommendations. So in Mindstone itself, since we're a learning company, you can set yourself a learning goal or a learning objective. And what we will try to do is we will try to build sort of a course, or we'll try to suggest you content that would match that learning objective. And, you know, this is purely based on what we would call like recommendations. And how would you do that before sort of LLMs came about? Well, I thought it was quite funny when I did this slide, because the image is broken on purpose. But basically what I wanted to say here is that we were never able to do it actually before LLMs came about, because the way you would do recommendations, and this is how all the big platforms also function today, platforms like Facebook, like Instagram, where they will try to suggest content for you. they would do it purely based on the social graph. So you need to, follow people or interact with people that have similar interests to you, and the content that those people consume would be recommended to you. So the technology there is not very strong. You just have other people doing the work of what we call the algorithm at that point. And when you think about it, okay, we don't have the social graph. We don't have enough volume to cover every possible learning objective you could ever imagine. How would you do this? Well, the answer with LLMs nowadays is embeddings, and I'll go quickly explain what embeddings mean. So embeddings mean like they're actually feature vectors, and if you've ever done any machine learning in the past, you'll be familiar what a feature vector is. But a feature vector is just a representation, a slice of numbers, a representation of the thing you are training on. And I specialized before in computer vision, and images are the best way I could explain this. And for an image to be translated in a feature vector, and it's like a very, very basic use case, you could take every pixel, take the red, green, and blue values, and then put them in a list. And that would be your feature vector. And what LLMs work on is they would take a piece of text and do the same thing. They would translate a piece of text into a list of numbers, and those list of numbers would be your embedding. Okay, cool. We've translated our piece of text into a vector. What can we do with that? Well, the really smart thing that OpenAI did is that it allows you to compare these vectors. So the vectors themselves would measure the relatedness of strings. That means you can take two pieces of content, vectorize them, and then compare the vectors themselves to figure out how related these two pieces of content are. And this is really the center of what your recommendation algorithm would be based on. So if you imagine that as a user, I come in and I want to send my current learning objectives, I want to learn more about the use of technology in urban planning. So you would vectorize that learning objective itself. You have a certain volume of articles that are also vectorized, and you would literally search the distance vectors between my learning objective and my content, and basically rank them by that distance of how related they are, and serve them to the user. So if you ever wanted to do recommendations, this is the way to basically do it nowadays. And this is exactly what I just talked about. You would vectorize a thing, you would store it, and you would measure the distance. There are a lot of products that are sort of coming up that would do this process for you, so you don't have to do it manually. And if you ever follow sort of investment news, you would notice that Weave8 and Pinecone have gotten huge sums of money in to develop this for you, and they would exactly do this process for you. So you would put your thing into Weave8, they would vectorize it for you, store the vectors, and then you can just do a regular search on top. Our experience, so we're using Weave8 in production. Our experience here has been that they're not very mature yet. So for example, we've had trouble replicating Weave8, we've had trouble with some of the queries not working very well, and we've also had trouble with changing the vectorizer models. So for example, if you're using OpenAI now and you want to switch to Cohere's vectorizer, you would have to basically reindex all of your data, which makes using them, if you don't already have an existing backend, fairly easy. But if you wanted to do some more complicated stuff, they're not necessarily there yet. So I just wanted to raise a point of caution here that, all your old favorites can do it too. So you don't have to necessarily go and run off all of this new tech that's coming in. If you have Elasticsearch deployed in your organization, if you have Postgres deployed, if you have Redis deployed, they can do vector distances for you. So you have to do vectorization yourself, but you can store them into these databases that you all know and are very mature, and it's very well known how to scale them. And you can perform your vector distance on top of them. And I wanted to briefly mention at the end that, as the whole space is growing, naturally, the same way there are tools built on top of like Google Cloud that will help you manage stuff within, there are tools that are built on top of these models to also help you like run them in production. And I just have highlighted like these three here, particularly because I know the people that work with them, and even Agent Runner is giving a talk, I think, somewhere today as well. So Human Loop, for example, would allow you to evaluate your prompt performance. And what I mean by that is ChatGPT is not deterministic. You can put the same query in and get two results out. And obviously they are going through scaling problems. So, you're gonna hit rate limiting, you're gonna ask for JSON, and occasionally it's not gonna give you JSON back. And obviously these are things that you don't necessarily hit when you're a single user using ChatGPT. You just try again. But when you're running this at scale, having observability is really important. So Human Loop are a platform that can sort of evaluate your prompt performance, like how often does it fail? Does one prompt perform better than another prompt? How often do you hit the rate limiting? Are your users actually responding to what you're doing? So you can tie it to like a button and say like, was this helpful? Was this not helpful? And then you can track your prompt performance against that. Agent Runner would allow you to develop autonomous agents. And what do we mean by agents is we mean, software running on GPT that performs tasks for you. So our use case at Mindstone is, again, with a learning objective. When you put your learning objective, sometimes because learning objective is free text, we don't have enough content in our platform as a whole to suggest content back for the specific learning objective. So what you can do there is you can have an agent that would go out into the wild. So you can say to this agent, go to Google, find me a piece of content that's related to my learning objective, scrape it and give it back to me. And that would be something autonomous that would just run for you and perform tasks for you. And the last two I wanted to highlight is Mystic. So Mystic allows you to deploy models yourself. And what do I mean by that is there are companies developing open source models, and this happened literally this week after I had written my talk. Meta released Llama 2, which is free for commercial use, and it is quite a decent model when you compare it to GPT-3. But you need to deploy it yourself. So you can use something like Mystic to like get this open source model, just deploy it and use it as you would OpenAI at that point. And to leave you with a thought at the end of the talk is, I had this slide, but the opposite earlier, which I was claiming that a lot of the companies that are building currently with GPT sort of have the technology first, and they're coming up with a problem to fit this technology. What I want to say here is that you should do the opposite. You should have a problem and then see like, can GPT or any of the other LLMs can help you sort of solve this problem. Basically, what is the one thing that you always wanted to build, but you couldn't? As it was for us here, where I had 3 different examples of stuff that we couldn't build, but now we could after we got access to this. And yeah, that is my talk. Thank you all. Darren, shall we transition to the Q&A section? Were there any?
Yeah, amazing. Thank you. There aren't any questions in Q&A at the moment, so please do get your questions in. We've got another about 20 minutes left of the talk, so anything that piques your interest during the last half an hour, please stick it in the Q&A or in the chat function, whatever you prefer, and then we can ask Stefan it. Hopefully you have some questions. So we've got one. How do you choose the tech you use? Obviously, this is a rapidly changing environment, and it's hard to know what system to trust.
Very good question. A lot of, well, there are multiple components to this. So one is access. So GPT-4 had a wait list. Azure has a wait list. So a lot of the times is, well, what can you get your hands on, I suppose. And the other thing is, make sure you abstract your infrastructure in a way that will allow you to swap them in and out when a better thing comes along. So we have a way to switch our models on the fly. So for example, for some things we would use GPT-4, for some things we would use GPT 3.5 to like basically offset the cost and where the performance is not as important. Also, we have a way to go to Azure, which is also based on OpenAI, for example, but they have a lot less load, which means you get less rate limited over time. So for some really, really crucial stuff, we would go to Azure, then come back. Then if we need to use GPT-4, we would use GPT-4 instead. So the choices, yeah, between all of these, basically, how often does it fail, and make sure you generalize for. Like right now, yes, you're correct. The field is moving so quickly that you don't necessarily know. But by most metrics, OpenAI is the best performing one, but it's not the most stable because everybody knows the most performant one, so everybody is using it, and they have growing pains at the same time.
Right. What, if anything, has surprised you the most about working within AI or LLM?
It's something that I thought quite a lot as an engineer, and it is that LLMs are not deterministic. So we as engineers are quite used to calling an API with the same query and then getting the same response back, regardless of how many times you call it. And a big sort of hurdle mentally that you have to get over is that LLMs almost behave as a person, like as if you would ask your colleague a question. You know, sometimes they'll be correct, sometimes they'll be wrong, sometimes they'll be half correct or somewhere in the middle. And that's been an interesting way of building a product. You have to quite often just run the same query multiple times and then have like a secondary step to anything that you're doing with LLMs, as in do it quite a few times at the beginning and then rank the responses that you get against each other to figure out which one is actually the most correct one from the response that you get back.
Perfect. Can we use GPT-4 on data sets of less than 100,000 rows if its image also is less than 100,000 images, since GPT was trained on billions of parameters?
Depends what you mean by that, because you wouldn't send your whole data set to GPT unless you're doing some kind of fine tuning on this model where you want to base the responses on your data set itself. Like if you have a data set, a big data set, what you do is you would vectorize each individual piece of content or each individual image that you're passing through, and you're going to store that in the embeddings and then perform queries on the vectors themselves on your site. You wouldn't necessarily send all of these 10,000 rows at once to GPT-4.
Okay, great. Any other questions, guys? How to deal with outliers on images using CNN?
That's convolution neural networks. I won't be able to answer that because I haven't trained the model in a very long time.
Okay, nice and easy.
Yeah, this is the democratization that I was talking about, right? You wouldn't, and I think what the person asking is touching upon is that they're talking about training your own model. So if you have a data set of 10,000 images, you will train your own model based on a data set with a convolution neural network, and then you will produce your own model and use it like that. While GPT is like a general purpose model, you can throw literally anything at it, and you don't necessarily have to train it. You can just fine tune it to point it to do slightly different things.
We talk about democratizing complexity, but democratizing means access remains free, very cheap to things like GPT, but this means that our data is obviously the product. Can we trust these companies to handle our data and use it more responsibly than we've seen by, say, social media companies in the past?
Very good question. It's something I've been wondering myself as well. I want to say yes, but maybe that's a bit naive, because yes, they will be using the data that you sent, quite likely to train the model further, and you have to be comfortable with that. And I would say you have to sort of decide per use case. Is this use case that you're using it for okay for this data to be sent away? Or, you know, a lot of big corporations wouldn't be comfortable with that, because they consider their data sort of their value or their IP, and they wouldn't necessarily want to send it somewhere into the void to be used for, you know, who knows what. But on the other side, like you see Meta, and it's very weird to say where like we think of Facebook as, you know, the worst example of like a social media company like harvesting data. But Meta are the ones actually doing these open source models that you host yourself, right? And your data is not leaking anywhere. So they're actually the one leading the democratization of you know, having OpenAI, even though OpenAI is called OpenAI. And it's a very weird like dichotomy to see. And, you know, it's probably strategic for them, because they do want to change their reputation from, you know, we're the big data harvesting corporation to like, you know, look where we're going against like this new way of doing AI, and we let you just use this model yourself, and you don't have to send us any data.
As a software developer, what is the solution to make AI better and easy to use? Because a lot of vulnerable people have been scammed lately. Does that question make sense?
Yeah, it does make sense, and I imagine he's just referring to, you know, nowadays with like the agent stuff I showcased, is you could have sort of bots calling you, or, you know, bots writing your emails, and like a lot more, I would say, elaborate sort of phishing and scamming tactics that you could now use. As a developer, I don't think you could do very much. Like on one side, it's like if you're building a product, say you're Google, and you know you have a way of figuring out that, you know, these emails that are coming through are actually dangerous. That's like one way you do it. And the other thing is like, it's actually just law. And we know a technology like this, law is a bit behind in general. So it would take a bit of time so people can, you know, actually produce laws to like guard against this, and like force companies to actually have features that will prevent this.
Apart from Meta, who would you say is the biggest user of LLMs currently?
Interesting one. The biggest one, I wouldn't know. I know Google, for example, because of DeepMind, they would use it quite a lot, but that's more from me like talking to people that they would use it internally. So they want to get an internal advantage for their organization, rather than providing that as an API for other companies to use. So my guess would be Google in terms of scale. And, you know, they're also the ones probably with actually the most data to train these things, because yeah, they literally have access to any web page in the world.
Nice. I'm going to say take advantage of the gap in questions to get yourself a drink.
Talking is surprisingly tiring.
It really is. It really is. Any final questions? We've probably got about another 3 minutes of questions on this stream. guess this is a broad question, and I'll take final one if there's no more questions. Like, where do you think the future is? Like, what do you want to see happen in the future when it comes to LLMs? Like,
I'm waiting sort of for the hype to end in a way, and because there is a lot of stuff that's getting based on these LLMs right now, as I showcased earlier, like so many ways to like chat to this thing, and I want more, I suppose, people to think a bit more clearly about like what features actually make sense to beat with these LLMs, so we don't just get a chatbot in literally every application that we use. And I'm a lot more interested in like those type of features, like just very, very clever ways of using these things, because they seem to have like implicit or tactic knowledge of some things that are not necessarily like trained for. Like, for example, they weren't necessarily trained to be able to translate languages, but they can. So like, what other things you would sort of uncover that they're able to do? And like, the only way to do that is with like just experimentation and basically experiment quite a lot of things and see sort of really, really smart way of using them.
yeah, it's always interesting when you get hype. Sometimes you get innovation off the back of it. Because I think that everyone got very, very excited when ChatGPT came out. Like, people that have got nothing to do with tech, like I was sat there, and when it got released, everyone was getting very excited by it, and I was trialing on every kind of which way.
Yeah, it is happening. I mean, their numbers did like drop a bit for the last month. So like now we're gonna settle into like, okay, let's let this thing mature and see like what's the interesting cases are.
Yeah, and then we'll give this as your final question, unless there's any others that come in. Do you think LLMs pose a threat to our current ways of working, or do you think it will enhance the ways we're working?
Yeah, I have opinions for that, and like it's a shame that we don't have a lot of time for that. It was very surprising to me that, you know, we continuously talked about how like manual labor would get automated first. Like if you're a driver, for example, a truck driver, like my dad is a truck driver, like there was always this thread that would come in that, you know, you're gonna have automatic cars soon. Your job is going away, and it's interesting to see that the opposite happened, where actual creative work would get automated first. And the answer to this is it'll be both, and it will enhance a lot of stuff, but you know, also like all the industrial revolution stuff, a lot of people would be on the losing side, and they will need to find a way to transition from whatever they're doing now to something new. And my real hope for this is that you could actually use LLMs to help with the transition rather than necessarily being the threat.
Right. And is there any, because people on the call that maybe are coming to this early in their time, is there any resources you'd recommend, like to start understanding LLMs in more detail?
Not any specific ones. Like at this point, I think there are so many resources everywhere, and even in this conference about how to use them. Just treat them. I would say just treat them as slightly unreliable as you would ask a real person, but do give it a try for things, and just be open-minded and give it a try to see if they'll be able to help you in whatever you're doing. Even for coding, I think we're quite resistant, but like even for coding, they're helpful in some cases.
Awesome. If there's no final questions, I'll call time on this then. Firstly, obviously, thank you so much, Stefan, for being involved in this. Hopefully everyone has learned a lot off the back of the talk. I want to give you the floor one final time to see if there's any closing points from you.
Not really, just thank you for coming to my talk, and yeah, I do hope it was useful for all of you.
Awesome. Thank you, everyone. Take care.
Thank you.